serviced by prosecutors and judges. These men faced roadblocks along the way. We also reported on issues in the Elkhart City Police Department, disciplinary issues, mistakes and misconduct that we found, including an excessive force case where 2 officers beat a handcuffed man, and then showed that many high-ranking officers in the department had many officers, high-ranking officers in the department, had been promoted to those positions despite problematic disciplinary histories, and how the police chief who was there at the time seemed to be not only taking a very hands-off approach to discipline when there were cases of misconduct, but also providing inaccurate information about cases of misconduct to the city's civilian leadership.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, my name is Daffodil Altan. Sorry. I am actually as of today, I'm officially a staff investigative producer and correspondent for FRONTLINE. And yay! And our project we did as a collaboration. FRONTLINE does a lot of amazing collaborations, so I was part of the UC Berkeley Investigative Reporting program. And we basically took apart a labor trafficking criminal story to really show how labor trafficking plays out in the US. So we told the story of a group of Guatemalan boys who was smuggled into the US, and eventually they were forced to work against their will at an Ohio egg farm, one of the 5 biggest producers in the country. But that happened because the government also inadvertently handed the boys to their traffickers. So we kind of took the elements of this crime apart to show really how labor trafficking is playing out in various industries all over the country.
My name is Dave McSwain. I'm a reporter.
Just hold it closer.
Okay. My name is Dave McSwain. I'm a reporter with the Dallas Morning News. Can you not? I'm a reporter with the Dallas Morning News, based in Austin, and with my reporting partner Andrew Chavez, who's somewhere here. We did a series showing how private Medicaid companies entrusted with some of the most vulnerable people in the state of Texas were systemically denying care to really sick children and disabled people, and vastly overstating their network, saying they had all these doctors available to patients, but they did not, and that this sort of behavior increased their profits.
My name is Ginger Thompson, and I'm a senior reporter at ProPublica. Can you hear me? I'm part of a team of reporters. It's newsroom-wide. We wrote stories about the government's zero tolerance policy, and the stories that we did ultimately triggered the end of the family separation policy. It started with an audio tape. Our coverage started with an audio tape that was recorded inside a detention facility where children were being held who had just been separated from their families. We published the story about that audio, and from there our newsroom sort of mobilized and began writing not only about that policy and the effects of that policy on the children and the families, but also about the facilities that were holding these children and the harm that was happening to those children in government facilities.
Hi, my name is Wendy Ruderman, and I'm a reporter with the Philadelphia Inquirer. We did a series called Toxic Cities, Sick Schools, in which we looked at building conditions in Philadelphia public schools that were making children sick. So most of the schools in Philadelphia are extremely old and run down, which was not a secret. But what we hadn't realized was that they were slathered in lead paint that had gone unrepaired for a really long time, and children were getting sick from breathing in and eating lead paint, and also schools that were built before 1980, which is the majority of them in Philadelphia, were filled with friable asbestos that the school district was not able to keep up with, and we found lots of asbestos fibers in the millions in settled dust that teachers and kids were being exposed to. We also looked at the lead content in the water that the kids were drinking. We looked at them doing construction projects during school hours, and we showed how children were actually harmed. We had one student who was in 6th grade, or he was a 6-year-old, sorry. He was severely lead poisoned while in school. He lost his ability to do simple math. He became extremely hyper, and he'll probably have behavioral problems for the rest of his life. And we also interviewed children who had been exposed to carbon monoxide poisoning and had passed out in school during a construction job that went awry. We also interviewed kids whose asthma was so severe while in school, because one of the things we looked at was toxic mold, that they had been hospitalized over and over and over again, forcing them to miss school. One of the things that I guess was unique about this project, for me anyway, and our team, was that we enlisted teachers and staff to help us do environmental testing inside the schools. And it was really extraordinary for the teachers to risk their jobs to help us prove that there were toxins invisible to the eye at hazardous levels inside the schools. So I really have to thank them for helping us.
Hi, my name is Connor Sheets. I'm an investigative reporter at Alabama Media Group in Birmingham, Alabama. I did a series of stories over the course of most of last year focused on the Etowah County Sheriff's Office, and basically looking largely at this practice of sheriffs pocketing large sums of money that was intended to be spent to feed inmates in their county jails. And so we focused largely on this one sheriff who we found that he had reported that he had kept over $750,000 worth of state, federal, and county and local funds that had been allocated to feed these inmates. And then he proceeded to, that was over 3 years, and towards the end of the 3rd year, he purchased a $740,000 beach house. So he became the quote-unquote beach house sheriff, and from there we spent most of the year looking at...
fed them dog food, right?
Well, not dog food, but I mean...
Not fit for human consumption.
Sure,
food
that,
on the tubes.
Yeah. So it was tubes of, it was this gray meat product that three inmates on the record and one on background told me that they had been serving to, that they actually that had worked in the kitchen. They told me they actually served this meat product to inmates. And, a lot of inmates lost large amounts of weight while they were in this jail, even for small periods of time. And, they were basically there's a wide range of things that they had to go through related to the food. And so I spent the year looking at a range of different things. This sheriff also spent pistol permit money, which is when you get a pistol permit, it costs $20. That money goes into a fund. The sheriff used that money to purchase campaign ads, or ads during his campaign that he claimed were not campaign ads. And, a number of other things that he's done over the course of his career. So that was basically my project.
I'm Joe Palazzolo, the Wall Street Journal. Everyone hear me? Okay. I was part of a team of journal reporters who reported that the president's friend at the National Enquirer, David Pecker, and his personal attorney, Michael Cohen, made payments to women who had alleged affairs with the then candidate Trump before the 2016 election. I'm with the Journal's Law Group, Michael Rothfeld, who's also here as part of the investigative team, and then Rebecca Balhouse and Rebecca Davis O'Brien, 2 other reporters, Nicole Hong. Anyway, there are many people who worked on these stories with me. I'm just the lucky one who gets to be up here and talk about it with you all. So looking forward to it.
Every year when we have the Goldsmith Awards, I always get a little depressed reading all the entries, because it's like a catalog of human depravity. And because you cannot believe the abuses of power. But what gives me hope and excites me is the work these journalists do to hold that power accountable and to really try and bring light to some of the darkest parts of our world. We have here an incredible group from the very national with the stories about Trump and hush money, and to the very local with Connor and the sheriff. We have from the very specific in South Bend to the systemic in the case of the school system and health insurance in Texas. And it's a really incredible range of journalism. I'm going to start by asking Ginger here to my right from ProPublica, you know, that audio you have really, I think it's fair to say, changed the national discussion about family separation, the detention of children, and the immigration policies this administration is pursuing. And it must have been very hard to get that audio.
I can't say that it was hard to get. I think it was hard to have recorded, I have worked on the border for a long time. I have sources who I've known for decades, and when one of my sources came in touch with this audio, she was looking for a reporter. I mean, she could have gone to a bigger news organization, but I think she was nervous about what she had. She was nervous about having the person who recorded this audio get identified. And so she wanted a reporter who would walk her through the process of releasing this thing, right? And not a reporter who she thought might take it and run with it. And so she called me and she said, there's this audio tape, and it's got voices of children who were just separated. And I actually got the tape through an encrypted program on my phone when I was driving home from my mother's house with my significant other. And so the first time I heard this tape, I had put it on our car stereo. And if you've heard this tape, it's pretty chilling, right? It's just children screaming until it's like they can't breathe. They're screaming so hard for their mothers and fathers. I knew immediately that this was potentially important. We didn't know for sure that it was what I was told it was, right? So then the reporter part kicks in, you know, where you have to authenticate the tape. You have to try to get the source who called me to give me the name and identity of the person who recorded the tape so that I could verify that the tape was real and understand how the tape was recorded. And those things sort of, you know, there's a little girl on this tape who made the authentication of the tape pretty easy, because she asks for a phone call. She asks the Border Patrol to let her make a phone call to her aunt, and she blurts out the phone number. And so this little girl who's just been separated from her mother from Salvador at 4 years old remembers a phone number. And that phone number not only, I think, allowed her to stay connected to her mother, because there was no plan to reunite that girl with her mother. There was no plan in place to reunite these families. But that phone number also allowed me to figure out where her family was and call them and authenticate the fact that this tape was real. And so, we published the tape on a Monday. By Tuesday, it's on, members of Congress are playing it on the House floor, and by Wednesday, the president is signing an executive order that ends the family separation part of zero tolerance.
And that's an incredible story. What surprised you most about reporting on this story, or what happened after it was published?
So even today, first of all, we later found that months after the president promised that he wasn't separating children, in November we found that he was still separating children, and we found they were doing it in exactly the same sort of chaotic way, where they were sending children off, picking them up at the border, sending them off to like New York, right, without any paperwork that indicated that that child had been separated from a parent at the border, right? And so we were learning a lot about the Border Patrol's discretion to be able to identify who they thought was a dangerous father or mother and take that child, which can't happen anywhere else in the child, protection system. If you want to take a child from a parent anywhere else in the legal system, you have to prove to a judge that that person is a bad parent. Not if you're an immigrant at the Border Patrol has the discretion to call you a bad parent, to call you a risk to your child, and to take your child. And throughout the process, there's a federal judge who ordered the administration to stop separating kids. And he has continued to watch over the government as they reunified kids. And every hearing, just about every hearing, this judge has to remind the government about the tenets of civility and humanity. He's always sort of saying to the government, you remember, these are human beings we're talking about here, right? I want you to reunite these families because these are human beings we're talking about. And I'm always my breath is always taken when these hearings happen and the judge, again, tells the government the same thing.
I do want to highlight that it was your expertise reporting on this beat and your long relationships with sources that allowed you to break this story.
I think that's right. My sources, I think, I teach at Columbia. One of the things I always tell my students is your reputation starts now, right? A reporter is only as good as their sources. And your sources, if they don't trust you, you won't get stories. And so my sources don't all like me. They don't all love the stories I do. I have sources, I've written very critical stories about agencies that are unhappy, but they all know that before anything runs, I will talk to them. They all know that there are no surprises in my reporting. There's no ambushing in my reporting, and they know I care about getting the story right. I really care about that, and I think that having the breaking of the story was old school. It's just a reporter and her sources, and so.
Thank you. Can you just pass that mic down to Christian? And I'm going to ask Christian, I wanted to ask you about the challenges of reporting on the police in an investigation like this, especially in smaller communities where they're going to know where you live.
I think one of the main challenges that we faced reporting on the police was just that they didn't want to talk to us. There was one town hall meeting after we had done some reporting on misconduct in the Elkhart Police Department where, even though when we had asked the police for comment on the stories that we were doing and they declined to talk to us about our reporting, the assistant police chief stood up at this town hall meeting and spent a few minutes sort of denouncing the work that we had done and saying that we had ambushed his officers by calling them at their work phone numbers to ask for comment on stories and things like that. So I think the challenge was, even though we had a lot of public records to work with and did a lot of stories that were very grounded in documents and records, oftentimes the subjects of the stories, including the highest ranking officers in the police department, just didn't want to talk to us and tell their side of the story. And then went on to, tell their side of the story to what they viewed as maybe sympathetic audiences, like a local news talk radio station. So that I think was one of the surprising things, was that these individuals just didn't want to, I guess, engage with the things that we were finding.
How did you find this story? Like, how did you start pursuing this?
So we had first started looking into criminal justice in Elkhart County because of some wrongful conviction cases, and then after we had found a lot of problematic things in one of these cases in particular, we wanted to look at accountability in the police department in general. And when there were mistakes and misconduct happening in the department, how that was being dealt with and what the outcomes were, to see what the culture was like in the department. And so we started basically trying to compile a fairly comprehensive list of disciplinary cases and how they ultimately were resolved. And in doing that, we actually ended up stumbling on a case where these two officers had been written up for excessive force, and we didn't know exactly what it was about. Disciplinary cases in the department under the now former chief, but the chief at the time that we were doing the reporting, were very few and far between. And there had been a very steep drop-off in officers who were being written up for misconduct after he became chief. So when we did run into recent cases, we were really curious to see how they were being handled. So we noticed that the only cases for the entire year of 2018 up through July, I think, was this excessive force case for two officers. And the way we knew that was we had looked at all the minutes from the meetings of the city's police civilian oversight board for several years. And so we had very scant detail. We just knew it was an excessive force case. So we pulled the personnel files, pulled the audio of the meeting where the police chief had presented this disciplinary action, and then asked for the video of what had actually happened, which turned out to be two officers punching a man who was in handcuffs in the detention area at the jail.
And two of the officers faced criminal charges, which is, I think, pretty unusual to have police officers brought up on criminal charges.
Yeah, that was one of the other really surprising things that happened was we asked for the video of this incident, and about 3 weeks after we asked for the video, I think it was on a Friday afternoon around 5 o'clock on a Friday, which is a classic time for public officials to drop news on you. I got a call from the police department spokesman, and he said, "Hey Christian, you requested this video he didn't say 3 weeks ago, but you requested this video. I just want to let you know that that's ready for you to pick up now. And by the way, we're going to be sending out a press release that the two officers are being charged with battery," which was a huge shock because this was 10 months after the incident had actually happened. And originally the case was dealt with a simple written reprimand for each officer, and that had essentially, the case had been closed for several months until we asked for the video. And then I'm not sure if city attorneys got to look at the video, or my understanding is the mayor hadn't seen it until we asked for it. So
I'm going to turn now to the other end to Connor Sheets, who you also reported on law enforcement, although an elected sheriff, who I understand threatened you or your family.
So that's it wasn't the sheriff that actually threatened me. I received a number of anonymous threats through email and through calls and things, and there was a lot of discussion in the community about, I was getting into topics that were, dangerous to be looking into, and it was just sort of more, it wasn't real, there was never direct threats from the sheriff, no.
An environment of intimidation.
Sure. Yeah.
And how did you, what was the hardest part of reporting on this story?
I think the hardest thing on this story, to me, was really trying to, nailing some of these things down, because a lot of what we were hearing, we'd hear a lot of rumors about things that were going on in the jail, or things that were happening with some of the, with some of the money, uses of the money that were going on with the sheriff's office. And I think for me, we really had to get a lot of documents and records and things like that. And some of that came easy and some of it didn't. And so, like the number of stories we weren't able to do is not a short list, but, so we're sort of really trying to figure out what can we actually publish. I think that might have been the hardest thing overall, I'd say.
How long did it take you to report on the story? What was that process like?
So, this is a series of stories, but I guess the first story about, this whole series started off with, there was a teenager who was arrested, a teenager who basically came to us with a tip saying that he had received a check from the sheriff for mowing his lawn that said jail food funds in the corner, and that, which was crazy. And so he told my editor, Challen, who's here, about that, and Challen brought it to me, and I wasn't that.
Hold on, so a teenager noticed this and brought it to your editor.
Right, and it was a couple years after he initially had it, so there was some like news in the state about this issue of jail food funds. He put the 2 and 2 together, brought it to my editor. I didn't see the value immediately. He kind of forced me to realize it, and so that's sort of how this all came about. And so I reported on the fact that this kid was paid with this check that said jail food funds, right? And so a couple days later, he gets arrested. He's charged with drug trafficking. He had 14 grams of marijuana mixed with butter. The kid. So, you know, according to the police report, he had 14 grams of marijuana that was mixed with a bunch of butter, which went over a kilo, apparently, which is the amount that is considered drug trafficking in Alabama. So he was hit with a charge that has the potential to be, you know, many years in jail. Never been arrested before. So I wrote about that, and then 6 days later, they dropped all the charges except for the lowest one. So at that point, I said, okay, something's going on here. I'd like to look into the sheriff a little more and what's happening. And so from there, you know, pretty quick order, we put together the Beach House sheriff because it was really based on a lot of public records. And so, I mean, I don't know, a couple weeks for that one. And then throughout, from there, I mean, different stories took longer amounts of time, but yeah.
And have you visited the house?
Well, yeah, so I mean, I've not entered the house, but I've been past it, yeah. Yeah.
What was the hardest part about reporting on this story?
Well, like I was saying, like I think for me it was, you know, just being able to, I guess reporting on it would be sort of piecing all these things together to create like a coherent narrative. So you get little bits of information. You have a, you know, so you get a hold of the records for the pistol permit money. What is there within that, within those records, and how can you sort of flesh that out enough to become a publishable story that really has impact? And I guess also just sort of the reticence of people within law enforcement to want to talk about anything related to this. I mean, you know, at first I was getting interviews with the sheriff and able to, you know, he did a big press conference that attained some level of infamy. But then, you know, as we continued reporting, it got to where, you know, really I was on my own to sort of be able to find this stuff out on my own and really do the reporting. So, yeah.
Thanks. I'm going to ask you to pass the microphone to Joe. And just, Joe, you and your team's reporting on Trump and the hush money he paid and the relation with the National Enquirer has, I think it's fair to say, dominated the headlines over the last few months. And I wondered how you put that whole story together. What thread did you start pulling on?
So it started in 2016, just a couple of weeks before the election. A few weeks, I should say. My editor, Ashby Jones, got a tip.
Let's switch mics. This is my mic. Yep.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So Ashby got a tip about, you know, there was a lawyer who was based in California, and he was going around. And he was paying women money to keep quiet about alleged assignations with candidate Trump. And that's pretty much that's what we had, and so we were obviously facing pretty heavy deadline. The deadline being the presidential election, and you know, I mean, basically it was sort of parachute reporting, right? This was not a world we were familiar with. We learned who this lawyer was. He's a guy named Keith Davidson. He was on Good Morning America yesterday. If anyone happened to see it. We needed to learn about him, his clients, you know, who he would be representing in these deals. Anyway, so myself and Michael Rothfeld and others really just started dropping into a spreadsheet as many names as we could, people associated with him, throwing out calls. By the by, we figured out that the National Enquirer had entered into an agreement with a woman named Karen McDougal, former Playmate of the Year in 1998, to buy her story about an alleged affair with the president. From there, in that story we reported 4 days before the election, we mentioned that there was another woman, Stormy Daniels, who was also represented by this same lawyer, Keith Davidson. Of course, we suspected at the time that there was some similar arrangement with her, but we didn't have the reporting yet, right? So 4 days after it's published, Trump is elected, and then that was a back burner. It was something we were trying to figure out, over the next year or so, right, while we're covering the new Trump administration. I'm a legal reporter. There were lots of legal issues to cover in the Trump administration in its infancy, and there still are, for that matter. So really, we just sort of pushed. We kept trying to work our sources. We were really interested in the National Enquirer because we suspected the National Enquirer is, who was the likely payee or payor to Stormy Daniels, but that turned out not to be the case. And eventually, we had a breakthrough towards the end of 2016, where we got some good information that the pair was a guy named Michael Cohen. And so from there, we also learned at that time that he had used. We were told that he had used a shell company to facilitate the payment. So then that sent us on sort of a mad dash to find this company, which we ultimately did and then published the story.
Talk a little bit about the role of sources and also public records in this kind of reporting.
So the stories are anonymously sourced. A lot of the information in these stories was anonymously sourced. These are agreements that are by their nature secret, and so we felt that was a necessary, I don't want to say evil, but it was a necessary compromise, right? But we also needed something tangible. We needed, we needed to figure out where that company was. We needed to figure out the name of that company, and we needed to be able to hold something and put a link in the story to something that actually existed. And so we felt that was crucial. The initial story that was published in January, on January 12th, just basically said that Cohen had arranged this payment to Stormy Daniels. Now, at the time, we had been requesting records from various jurisdictions that have strong corporate secrecy because we had been told that there was the shell company. The name was, we were told, something really obvious, like Damage Control Inc. We had a hunch that it was Delaware because of its proximity to New York City. We knew that Michael Cohen had incorporated there previously, and so Michael learned that you can request these reports that are used internally in the Delaware Division of Corporations. It's a report of all corporations formed in a given time range, right? And so we had a general sense of when the payment was made. And so we requested all of the all companies formed in Delaware, for instance. We did this in other jurisdictions as well, but in Delaware in September and October of 2016. So we're talking thousands upon thousands of records, right? And we're looking for really obvious name. I mean, I wish I could show you the list of some of the stuff that we pulled out at the time. It was fun, to be honest with you. And
you definitely have the right job if you think that's fun.
Yeah. I guess fun is relative. I should recognize the audience here. So we got another sort of hint about it, right? This one person said, well, maybe you should check for a company with the name Resolution. And in fact, we did find one called Resolution Consultants. And Michael had the Division of Corporations, a really great, by the way, the spokesman there, he was extremely helpful. So I would encourage reporters to take advantage of the Division of Corporations in Delaware. And he pulled the formation documents. When you look up a corporation in Delaware, you get very little info. But when you pull the formation documents, you may get a kernel more. And sure enough, Michael Cohen's name was on it. It was the Michael Cohen.
What did it feel like to see that?
It was elation. It was relief. It was relief because we are. This is before we published the first story, right? These are sort of in parallel. So we're still looking for that something, that tangible something. We're confident in our sourcing, but to have the paper is just like another layer of comfort and relief that I hope that I'm adequately describing with my wavering voice and facial expressions. Anyway, but there was a problem with the resolution consultants because it was created in late September and dissolved in October, so, mid-October, before the payment had been made. And so it turns out, we didn't know why, but we suspected maybe Michael Cohen had done messed up the paperwork somehow. So we looked at all of the corporations created on the day that that resolution consultants was dissolved, and that's how we found Essential Consultants. And Essential Consultants, we pulled the formation documents again, and there, of course, was Michael Cohen's name. So then, of course, we had to push and push and push with our sources to actually confirm that Essential Consultants was the one used. But I'm sorry, that was long-winded, but the LLC chase was like very exciting for me.
I want to ask you about whenever you're doing a major investigation of the President of the United States, this must have gotten subjected to some real scrutiny from your editors.
Yeah. The journal process is amazing. It's like something to behold. The requirements, and I appreciate it deeply. But of course, if you're going to write a story that the president's personal lawyer paid a porn star, then you better be right. It was frustrating at times, because it was a very sort of normal push-pull between reporters and editors, where you said, we have the story. They're like, yeah, but you should get this, show us this, and in the end, the story came out the way the story came out. So,
wow. I'm going to turn now to Daffodil and a very different kind of story about human trafficking and child labor, and a really intense story. And one of the things about it is, it's an immigration story happening in Ohio, outside of Cleveland, if I recall, and kind of in the America heartland. And so I wondered, how did you find this story? Where did this story come from?
Is this the louder mic, or should I? This is the better mic. Okay. So this story had its genesis actually in our previous project, where we were reporting on women who were janitorial workers who were being sexually assaulted on the night shift. So that was the story. We were doing our reporting. We were looking for cases and women, etc. We found a case in Philadelphia that involved workers from Ukraine who were working as janitors. And it turns out that this sexual exploitation that was happening to those particular women was as a way to coerce them and to force them to work. So suddenly we found ourselves in a story about forced labor and labor trafficking in the middle of this other film. And so it was like a story that really needed to be told, but we didn't have the space or the time or the bandwidth, or frankly, the focus wasn't that for that film. But the story of these workers who were working at Walmart, at Safeway, at Target, this is a crime that, the thing that really struck us is it's a crime that's invisible, because the work that the people who are being exploited are doing is legal work. So you see a gardener, you see a janitor at night, you see an elder care worker, and they may be in a situation where they're being forced and held against their will, because they're being coerced psychologically, physically, sexually, and threatened. And so this particular case in Philadelphia involved all the workers from Ukraine were from one particular village, and the people who were exploiting them were a group of brothers who were from the home country. And so we had all kinds of questions around all of this. How does this work? These guys were from the same country, so some of them were here, one of them was there, so that they could threaten the workers and say, we're going to get to your child if you don't work. And so there was all of this going on, and all you see is a worker in a Walmart. And so we thought, we need to do something around this. We started looking around, what's been done, what kind of films have been done, what kind of reporting has been done. And it turns out as most of you probably know, there's a lot that's been done on sex trafficking. And in some ways, that story, the work itself is often not legal, so it's almost a clearer target. And we decided, okay, there's enough on sex trafficking, we need to do labor trafficking and not what's going on internationally, because there's a lot about chocolate and all kinds of industries that have forced labor. But how is this playing out in the US? Because the US tends to point the finger at other countries and their problems with forced labor, but it's actually going on in significant numbers and ways in industries here. So we finished that film. We had a small segment on that case because it was important, and we decided, our team, obviously, as we've all mentioned, none of us do this alone. It's really complicated work, and so there were multiple people involved. So we started just kind of canvassing and saying, okay, what's the story that we're going to tell? Are we going to tell multiple labor trafficking stories? Are we going to tell one? And the problem we had is that our previous film was about sexual assault or rape, and you say that and people know what the crime is. When you say labor trafficking, it's like, what is that? What's the crime? What are you talking about? Most people, including law enforcement, including victims advocates, everyone's trying to wrap their head around how to deal with this very real crime. And so we had the initial problem of needing to deal with the crime itself, which is invisible. How do we do this visually? Which story we're going to tell? So through our sources, we started identifying different cases. And we happened upon this particular case, which had gotten some news flash attention. And it struck us because of the different elements involved. Because, in some ways, it's interesting because there are all these facets to the immigration, the child story. And so in one sense, you're dealing with children being separated in one area, and this you're dealing with children who were sent all the way from far away point A, smuggled in, but they're predestined to a work site. And so what happens, who works to get them all the way over there? We found this case and we had all these questions. How do they get from remote Guatemala, my family's from Guatemala, and how do they get all the way to Ohio? Who was involved there? So we just started out with questions, and how are we going to get the answers to these questions? This is a crime that has a lot of layers, and we figured out and we found out that the traffickers manipulated the government system, knowing that children are placed with sponsors. They had these kids all the way from Guatemala with a phone number saying, okay, this is my person that I know that you need to place me with. And so they gave these numbers, and the government, overwhelmed as it says it was, our colleague did an initial story in the Washington Post about, the government placing all these children with problematic sponsors. Well, some of these sponsors are actually making the kids, they're forcing them into forced labor, prostitution, they're abusing them. And so we sort of tracked this story all the way, and we decided, let's take apart the crime of this story.
How do you tell that story? How do you take a big systemic, kind of complicated multi-layer issue and build a compelling narrative out of it?
Yeah, we decided instead of multiple cases, let's really take one apart. But it turned out that we picked the one that was probably the most difficult one to take apart because there was still an active, ongoing investigation. So the government was still actively investigating, and we usually have some access to government sources. We did not have this access. They couldn't, because they were actively investigating, really give us anything. And so we decided, okay, we have to do this visually as well. Who are we going to get to go on camera? Well, automatically in our previous projects, we want to try to find the victims. Well, all the victims were minors, and they were sealed off. Their identities were sealed, and we weren't getting anywhere as far as who, where, and so we had to think, how are we going to find them? And a lot of this starts with just little clues. So one victim, we saw that an uncle had called the police because he'd reached out for help. So our colleague found the uncle in Florida, Abby Vansickle, who's here, and we found this uncle, and he told his story, and we went all the way to Guatemala to the village to find the families of the victims so that then we could find them in the US. That's how difficult they were to find. And then when we found them, they were so traumatized and afraid. And even though we made contact with them, they didn't want to, they were terrified to go on camera. So we had to start thinking, what are the elements? Who are we going to get to tell this story? And we ended up pushing on, you know, who are the insiders in this industry? What about the criminal elements? Let's write letters to those who've been arrested. And as we started putting the crime together, we actually caught up with and ended up superseding the FBI's investigation in terms of finding the various criminal elements to this crime. We got a little too close, I think, in some sense.
What does that mean?
We were in the middle of our reporting, and someone who we'd identified as possibly being, in terms of the layers, you have a trafficker, but then you have, you know, the accountability part is that you have the government that's, you know, not paying attention and handing these kids over, and then you have industry that has this unrelenting demand for labor. And the demand is so unrelenting that they rely on all these contractors. And this is an area in labor that is totally unregulated. And so these contractors get immigrant labor, all kind, fake papers, everything, and they get kids. And so we started getting close to these various layers. We found an insider, and it turns out he was connected to the people who were involved in this case. And it turns out that pattern of abuse had gone on for years. So we found the contractors, and again, it was a band of brothers, not unlike the Ukrainian story. And so we started identifying who these brothers were and what was their connection and how did they know the trafficker in Guatemala. And one of these brothers that we'd identified as potentially being involved in this scheme also was possibly informing on his other brothers for the government. In the middle of our reporting, he died mysteriously, and I had talked to him weeks before. And when when someone told us, we looked the story up, and it was being ruled a homicide. And we felt suddenly like we were in the middle of something, asking too many questions. And these are criminal elements, so it just felt like, what are we doing, and is it worth it? And do we need to take a step back, and what does this mean for the story?
And was it worth it?
I think now that so we ended up tracking the other brother down, and he actually agreed to go on camera. But this is what was so surprising. We ended up not necessarily with victims on camera, but with the trafficker's mother in Guatemala, with an industry insider who had never spoken before, who talked pretty frankly about how the industry looks the other way. We ended up with the fugitive that the FBI was tracking, and they asked us, where is he? And we said, we're not telling you right now. And so we went and got that interview in Mexico. And so we ended up actually with some of the stronger criminal elements of this story, of revealing this story. And I think what it's become, a lot of the sources that were closed off to us in terms of victims advocates, attorneys, the government even, have now taken the film and they're using it in training for law enforcement, and it exists in a way that was necessary, I think, in terms of bringing the pieces of this crime together. So I think it was worth it. I mean, I hid out for a little while and took myself off social media when that happened because it was scary.
Wow. If I could ask you to pass the microphone just to David, and I also want, David, you and your partner's reporting is also kind of a big systemic question. Thousands of people, being denied different kinds of health insurance claims. Can you talk a little bit about also how you found this story and what the challenges were on reporting on a big, sprawling institutional and policy problem?
Sure. So a couple things came together. I'm based in the Austin Bureau and had covered the Texas Health Commission, which is one of the largest agencies in the country. And as legislative session was starting up, we were hearing from parents of severely disabled and sick children who'd said this new program that they were forced into called managed care was endangering their kids. They couldn't get prescriptions they needed. They were being denied equipment, things like that. And it seemed to be happening. I believe the parents, there was a lot we didn't know. And I did just one story on that to sort of, prime the pump, as we say, see what falls out. And at that same time, a lobbyist who, sort of unrelated to this, had come to me and said, hey, we heard about a foster child who is now functionally brain dead in a permanent vegetative state because he couldn't get the home nursing that he needed, that his foster mother was fighting for, that his doctors and nurses had been fighting for. And as part of that, got a hold of a memo that had been sort of sent around identifying an anonymous baby that sort of walked through what had happened. So I sort of had hints of a systemic, larger problem, and then we saw this case that, if true, seemed like a pretty horrific event, and sort of started looking into them both at the same time, and just went directly to the Health Commission, having covered the beat, and said, hey, I heard about this baby who's brain dead because he couldn't get the nursing he needed. And a few days go by, it got sent up to someone's supervisor, and I got a text at about 10:30, maybe 11 p.m. From one of the PR folks who said, I'm out hunting, I can't get into it, but read Trach Tube. There is no there. And I think I was watching TV or something. I get this text, and it was sort of just like, challenge accepted. I didn't believe him, and it took some work because of HIPAA, people couldn't just tell us who this child was, and they couldn't direct us to all of these patients we eventually found. But a few weeks went by, and are you able to hear me? Sorry. A few weeks went by, and ended up in the living room with the foster mother and the foster child, talking about what had happened. And thank God she was in the process of adopting this baby. Otherwise, no one would have been able to actually, provide medical records and authorize to tell the story. So as we waited for the adoption to be completed, we started finding all these other problems in other programs for adults, and found that this was happening across the board. These companies who sort of wrote their rules for themselves had made it easier to deny care, didn't have enough doctors available to patients, and it just sort of grew bigger and bigger. And towards the end of it, we realized that what had happened with this baby, Deshaun Morris, really represented, he experienced almost every single fail point we had encountered when looking at the system. So telling his story was an easy and understandable way, even for folks who don't understand Medicaid, to explain the injustice of this much larger system.
And the company, Superior Health Plan, is now, if I recall, their contract with the state is up for renewal?
It's being reviewed.
It's being reviewed.
Yeah.
By the Texas State Legislature.
By the Health Commission, though there are about 25 bills introduced in the legislature, which is what I'm doing now, just following those.
And can you talk about what it's like to see this reporting generate additional accountability?
Well, that's the best feeling in the world. I mean, that's why we do it. So after the series published, the initial 5 parts published, the Health Commission freed up about $7 million to hire about 100 new regulators, which includes nurses who physically visited patients in their homes, which are really sort of our eyes and ears on this program that we know little about because it's these subcontractors. And that was an immediate sort of gratifying feeling to know that these patients are going to be checked on.
So I'm going to, before I get to Wendy, I'm going to ask all the journalists on this panel. Sometimes the most interesting questions come when you ask each other questions. And so I'm going to ask Wendy a few questions. Then I want to see if any of you want to ask anybody else on the panel a question. And then we'll open it up to the audience. So everybody get their questions ready. So Wendy, this story was like anyone with children in the school system, this story made your blood run cold, that your kids would go to school every day in a building that is poisoning them. And I wondered, where did the idea for this story come from?
Well, initially, this is actually our third year doing a project on toxins in Philadelphia, and I'm hoping for a non-toxic year. But so we initially decided after Flint, Michigan, to take a look at lead paint in homes and why Philadelphian children are getting poisoned by lead at far higher rates than in Flint, Michigan, year after year. And so that was what we did that series in 2016, and then 2015 or 16, we decided to take a look at lead in soil, and we ended up showing how Philadelphia, as an old industrial town, there was toxic soil all over neighborhoods where children play, and that connected also with a housing boom, a gentrification that was going on in the area that was stirring up lead dust that kids were inhaling. And so the third part, we knew we wanted to look at schools, and we wanted to look at lead in schools, but we just weren't prepared for, like, as you point out, that it was almost inconceivable and very surprising that it's one thing to say that there's lead paint, that these buildings are slathered in lead paint, but to just think about it this way, that in Philadelphia and other cities, there are laws that protect children in rental homes from landlords renting homes to them where they are exposed to chipping and peeling lead paint because it's really unhealthy and detrimental to their brain. But there is nothing comparable in Philadelphia to the schools. So parents are legally obligated to send their children to school, but there is no obligation on the part of the school district to protect them from lead paint that's all over the place. And what we found was that kids were being exposed, kids in classrooms for special needs, kindergarten classrooms, first grade classrooms, to extraordinarily high levels of lead dust. And the school district was kind of like, yeah, you know, this is how it is. And I think parents felt that way. In some ways, I don't think they realized the extent of it.
Well, were you surprised by the scope of it?
Yeah, we were really, really surprised. And a lot of it came out during the testing. So we started testing for lead dust on surfaces, and we asked teachers to help us do the testing, and they would come back, the scores would come back really high, way higher than hazard levels required, limits that the federal government has for what's allowable on floors in rental properties. So that was number one. Then we decided, well, let's test for asbestos fibers. And we were stunned, really stunned, to find millions of asbestos fibers lurking in settled dust in these schools. And just to give you an idea, the EPA, when the World Trade Center came down, they used dust wipe samples to figure out whether or not apartments nearby in the financial district were contaminated by cancer-causing fibers. And their limit, their action level for cleanup was 5,000 asbestos fibers. And we were routinely finding 1 million fibers, 1.2 million fibers, 10 million asbestos fibers. There was asbestos fibers all over these schools. And it just honestly, it was incredibly alarming and surprising.
What was the hardest part about reporting the story?
It was definitely enlisting the people to help us do the testing, the staffers, the teachers, the nurses. I am not a crier. Like, I think I'm pretty tough, but I had moments where I just felt like crying because for we approached hundreds of teachers, and we tried to get people to, hey, do you want to get down on your hands and knees and test for cancer-causing asbestos fibers in your classroom, and risk your job doing it possibly. And so we got, for every 100 people we asked, out of 100 no's, we would get 1 yes, and then we would deliver the kits to them and train them how to do the testing, and then they would go dark on us, and it was an incredibly frustrating, daunting experience. It was definitely the most difficult part.
But you did it.
Yeah.
And, like some of the other stories here, this is also a kind of a big systemic story. How did you end up telling that story?
it was really, really difficult to organize it because we were sort of, once we started digging, first we started with the lead paint, and then we were like, let's look at lead and water, and then let's look at asbestos fibers, and let's look at molds and asthma triggers. And then at one point we kind of got crazy, and I was like, let's test for silica dust for when they're doing construction on, you know, brick pointing on these old buildings. And but then organizing it was really difficult, and my editor, Jim Neff, who's here today, he does this thing called whiteboarding, and we had all these stickies all over the place, and we probably make the Post-it company, Post-it note company rich, but we had all these Post-its, and we would like move them all around and try to organize it. We'd shift one thing over here, and it was really difficult to organize it, and Jim Neff really helped with that.
Wow. Amazing. Let me see. Is anybody, any of these journalists want to ask anybody else a question about their reporting? Yeah.
This is a question for you, Joe. First of all, can I get that Delaware official's number? No, I'm just kidding. But no, in all seriousness, so the LLCs, once you had the LLCs' names, how did you go from there to, and you know that obviously Cohen is connected to them. How did you go from there to being able to say, being able to tie that directly, just because he has an LLC? I mean, how could you go from there to the rest of the reporting? Was it based on interviews, or was there any other steps that you took?
Yeah, so we had multiple sources. Can you? Okay, hold on one sec. All right, I'm back. So we once we got essential consultants, we went back to the sources who had sort of given us the tip about these, the LLC being a vehicle or a conduit in the first place, and we pressed them. We found others. Once we had that, and we felt pretty confident based on when it was created. I mean, a lot of things lined up, right? There were a lot of circumstances, or there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that this was what was used. So then, once you have that. The other great thing about having the document is then you can take that back to your source and be like, looky here, and press them until you can, wheedle as much info as you can out of them and hopefully get them to confirm. So it wasn't until we felt absolutely confident, based on multiple sources, confirming that that was in fact the LLC that was used, that we decided to run with it.
Yeah, thank you.
In that case, I'll open it up to the audience. We'll love to hear any of your questions. You can direct it to the whole panel or to individuals on the panel. I'm going to start back. Yep. Irv.
This question is primarily to Joe, but to any of them. What changed in the water that you folks are drinking vis-a-vis the time of Roosevelt and Kennedy, where the press wouldn't report on these picadillos?
So I guess you're asking about a historical question about the attitudes towards to covering presidents and presidential candidates.
Well, without being too expansive here, I mean, I would say that people have said before that Bill Clinton was our first tabloid president, right? But in this case, for us, this wasn't about a peccadillo. It wasn't about sex at all. It was about hush money. It was about a cover-up that was made on the eve of the election. They were actively trying to conceal this information from voters because they thought it would be harmful, right? They were making a judgment that this was going to be bad for their campaign. If they're making a judgment that it's going to be bad for the campaign, then we have an obligation to make sure that people know that this happened. And so I certainly can't dispute that that the sex lives of politicians has become more of an interest, but I just want to emphasize that that certainly was not our interest in this story, and it is not our interest in this story to this day.
I think over here first. Yep.
So some of what you all do seems like it's pretty scary, going up against powerful people who don't want you poking your noses into what they're doing. And there's been a little bit of discussion about it, but I'd like to know more about how you handle that, how you personally deal with what seem like threats, and how you get up every morning and say, okay, let's go do this again.
So the question is about how do you hold power accountable, especially when it's hard when you're threatened or stonewalled or otherwise, yeah.
But the personal feeling of being in danger, and how do you deal with that?
Yourselves, how do you deal with that, and where do you find hope and resilience in this reporting? I mean, Ginger, I can't imagine reporting on child separation.
You know, the child separation part of the story isn't particularly dangerous, and I think what you're talking about is danger. I mean, I have worked on the border for a long time. I've worked in northern Mexico for a long time. I've written about the drug trade, and I've written about drug trafficking organizations, and those stories, you know, were a bit, you know, more dangerous. So I don't want it to sound like this kind of reporting. Certainly the government wasn't interested in having the child separation told in the way that we told it. Their narrative was this was a border security story, and this was about deterring people from coming. The voices that were left out until I think our stories were published were the voices of the children. But, you know, I'll take a stab at this, but I think this is more of a question for you all. I mean, I think that what, you know, reporters do in situations like the ones I've had is to do a lot of homework ahead before you go into a place. So you understand what you're, you know, the places you're going into, the people you're going to possibly be dealing with. And so, you know, it's not like we're cowboys. We take very calculated chances going in as safe as we can and doing the kind of homework we need to kind of figure out how we can keep ourselves safe, and more than that oftentimes is how we can keep the people who are talking to us safe. And a lot of times it's a lot of experience, it's a lot of work ahead of, you know, before I go into a place like that, I've done a lot of work and research and reporting to figure out how to make that happen. But I think you.
I think one of the things that struck me about, and I think I'm on the road a lot with my co-producer Andres Cedillo, and when you go out into Middle America, once you go past sort of the warm, fuzzy parts of Middle America and you go deeper in and you start asking questions, we were warned by sources when we were in these small towns that we were, you know, to be careful, you might be being watched, you know. There's a lot of secrecy in these towns that are predominantly, you know, they're in transition economically, but when you get to industrial agriculture and these industrial agriculture areas and towns, you have the immigrant population there, and then you have the traditional population there, and that's really, and they're either talking to each other or they're not, but they're entwined. And so when you go in there and you start asking questions, you know, we were stopped by the police when we were around an egg farm in Ohio, but like Ginger said, we'd done our homework. We were with the industry insider who was taking us to the farm, to the plant that used to house 180,000 chickens that he owned. But the new owners, which was the company we were looking into that had these enslaved children working on their property, they knew that they were on to us, so they sent the police out. We knew we were on a public road. We'd done all our homework. We knew how far, where the drone could fly, where it could shoot, what lines we were and weren't crossing, because when the police came, it was almost, there was nothing. They didn't have anything on us because we were within all of our boundaries reporting-wise, and we triple-checked that the person we were with and the property we were on, that he owned that through all the records that we pulled. So, you know, that feeling of being watched because you're asking questions in the heartland is really eerie. And there were times we decided, Andres and I, that we weren't going to stay in the small town anymore. We actually would go in and then we'd drive like an hour out just to stay somewhere else because it felt like we were being watched. And then when we come into the situation of identifying, you know, a network of brothers who are contractors on paper, but who are potentially having conversations with the trafficker, they're all involved to some degree. They're all complicit in the trafficking. So there isn't just one trafficker. Everyone is touching the crime. Everyone has a place in the crime, and that's one of the questions we were asking, is the accountability of, you know, how do you hold these companies accountable when there isn't a legal way to do so, or there just hasn't been the push to do that legally. But so when we're asking all these questions of the, you know, the brothers, and we're tracking them, well, we find one through a source, you know, we find where he is in Mexico. And we were having this discussion with our editors, and Lowell Bergman was one of my, he's the executive producer of the film, he's my editor, and another editor, and it's like, okay, you found him, go down and knock on his door. Go down and do it, was one editor. Another editor was saying, hold on, no. And we instinctually were saying, no. My family's from Guatemala. Andres's family is Colombian. Like, you have a sense that, like, you don't just drop in and knock on someone's door in places where you're being watched even more aggressively than here. And so we did actually a lot of reporting around his home, basically. What was the neighborhood? We talked to local reporters there. We wrote a memo. We got assessments. We talked to security people. We sent a reporter down there who went in for a couple of hours and back out, just to kind of, you can just kind of walked around and ask questions not even related, but very vaguely related to this fugitive. And they already knew his name, he was already being watched, and we got him out of there as soon as possible. But, you know, we had to do this assessment, and we decided, no, we can't just go knock on his door, actually. It's not safe to do that. And I think internally, as a reporter, you have to know what your boundaries are. You know, I'm not a war reporter, because I have a family, and I don't know that I'm willing to risk my life in that way. And so you have to ask yourself at various points, what am I willing to risk? What are the risks here, and what are we willing to do? And so when we negotiated the interview with the fugitive, we actually, based on security advice that we got, we decided what the location was going to be. We picked the hotel. It was in Mexico City, not in Guadalajara where he was. He came there. And so we were able to actually make it a very secure interview. But, you know, there are various points where you're kind of asking yourself, am I safe? Is this worth it? And how far am I willing to go for the story? It's stressful.
Yeah, I would say, for us, you know, so I did not actually live in the county where the sheriff that I was writing about is based, so that on some level provided some added sense of security, because obviously, you know, he didn't have the jurisdiction to really do anything at my home. But I think, you know, a lot of things we would do, like before I would go out there to interview someone or to pick up documents or whatever, we would always let a certain number of people know, like, you know, let my editor know. If you get a phone call, or if you don't get a phone call from me, you know, maybe I've been arrested. It never ended up happening. But, and then also, you know, basic things like making sure you have no taillights out and things like that, and driving 25 miles per hour on a road where everyone drives 50, even though because of the speed limit and stuff like that. And, but also, you know, at one point, I did a story about allegations with a woman on the record who, you know, alleged that she had had sex with the sheriff when she was a minor, and back in the 90s, and, you know, that story was particularly personal, and you know, the level of types of sort of threats that I was hearing and stuff ramped up around that time period. So we actually, my family, like we moved out of the place where, you know, out of Birmingham for a short period of time, just stayed with some friends and family and that type of thing. And so, so I think you have to take those things into account, but then at the same time, I think as journalists, you know, there's going to be some inherent risk, and I think you just have to, like they were saying, there's a lot of measuring that goes into it. In something like rural Alabama, where there's certain things you have to do, like if I have to go pick up documents at the sheriff's office, I don't know that there's any level of research that can be done to mitigate any risks. It's sort of, if someone chooses to pull me over and arrest me and throw drugs in the back of the car, you know, I mean, they can do that. So, I mean, at some level, you just have to take those risks. But I think that, you know, the type of reporting we're doing is risky in some ways, but I think there's a lot of people around the world who are doing much riskier reporting. So on some level, I guess that's a sense of comfort in some sense, or I don't know. Thank you.
Quite a few questions, so I'm going to ask we keep it brief. At the microphone here, and then we'll go to Maria.
Yeah, going back to the journal story again. You used anonymous sources, but we know now, of course, that Michael Cohen is a perjurer. Keith Davidson recently said that he knows of nothing that would directly implicate the president in the hush money payments. Stormy Daniels has had a couple of lawsuits against the president dismissed, and she had to pay the court costs. So I'm wondering what the purport of your story was. Are you trying by innuendo to link the president to this hush money payment, or do you have more hard evidence that he was directly involved in some sort of illegal behavior, or are you just leaving it ambiguous like this? I think the main principle here is the president and his direct connection with this, and that's not really being addressed.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage you to read the story that we published in November, in which we described in detail how Donald Trump was central to both of these payments. He directed them personally, and also the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York in Manhattan has also stated unequivocally that President Trump directed these payments. So, I mean, I feel like they're a pretty strong authority. I feel like our reporting has been very strong on this. Yeah, I mean, I think that, yes, our reporting has shown very strongly that the president is implicated in 2 federal crimes.
Maria?
Ginger Thompson, hey. Hi. So Maria Hinojosa, just wondering, kind of the context of immigration. We've been covering it for a long time, and suddenly now everybody's talking about it. So, and the fact that it didn't just start with Donald Trump, obviously. So you're kind of how you're processing that, the fact that in a lot of the reporting it seems to lack that context, first of all. And second of all, what is it like for you to know that we've been reporting about these stories, whether it's children being taken or women being sexually assaulted in detention facilities, and it didn't really stick until we had that audio?
Can you hear me talking?
How do you kind of put that together?
So the question is about the history of immigration reporting, and many of these challenges predate the Trump administration, and then how issues that maybe didn't quite have the public spotlight with the dramatic audio got a huge amount of attention.
So, I've known Maria and know her work for years. Thank you for the question. Look, I think that we've both been writing about this a long time. My last story at the New York Times was about the Obama administration and its deportation policies. Obama at that time had deported historic numbers of people from this country, and was, being widely criticized by the advocacy community for that. So it's true that, back in those days, there weren't many people who were covering immigration. It was, I think that reporters still take a lot of their cues about coverage from Washington, from the White House in particular. And when Donald Trump makes it the center piece of his agenda, then I think news organizations tend to move in that direction as well. And so we are seeing, and I'm very happy to see so many very, aggressive, reporters who do both narrative journalism and investigative journalism, dedicating their attention to this, for better and worse sometimes, right? This story, I think what happened with the audio and then the subsequent reporting from the audio is that, as I said at the beginning, when we obtained this tape, there was a very almost sterile conversation going on about the administration and its immigration policies. And there was this border security question. And the administration wasn't letting people into the detention facilities, into the shelters, to see what family separation looked like. And so what we knew about was there were separations happening. It was all about trying to deter lawbreakers from crossing the border illegally. We were going to prosecute their parents, and if you're going to prosecute a criminal, you have to take their child away from them, right? That's what we do in this country, so the administration said. But the voice that no one had heard from, because no one could hear from it, were the people who were being most impacted by this policy, which were the children. And so that audio, for the first time, gave voice to the children. And I think people, no matter what your politics are, there were Republicans who were listening to that tape and saying, I'm all for border security, but I'm not for that, right? And I think there's something that happens to a human being when you hear a child crying like that. And I think it moved people. And when it began to move Republicans away from the policy, I think that had an effect on the White House as well.
Daffodil, do you want to add anything?
Well, I think, part of it is, I mean, to Maria's point, I think sometimes a lot of this lacks context. And, when you're reporting on immigration and you're reporting on all these problems that are happening in this moment, it's, we're trying to look for ways in our work to give some of the historical context around what's happened in terms of immigration in this country forever. I mean, all kinds of laws, all kinds of policies against various different groups. And I feel like the more that we can kind of try to inject some of that context in, I said earlier today in a meeting, I feel like, one of the things that concerns me is we're living in a kind of a historical moment, it feels like sometimes, in terms of audience and how they're receiving story, and the sort of the way these stories move unrelentingly, thanks to just the way Twitter, I guess, social media, just sometimes it feels like some of these stories you just need to stop and sort of understand the larger issue and how we got here.
Okay, all the way in the back, and then we'll do David.
This is working.
That's right. So I'll repeat the question.
I have two questions. First of all, as a journalist, I always felt pretty confident going around the world with a press card. All that's changed under Trump. You've become the enemy of the people. First of all, do you feel physically kind of vulnerable now in a way you never were before to do your job? And secondly, are you pessimistic about the future with all the diminished resources in the newsrooms? There are plenty of stories, clearly you're doing such a great job, but are you just confounded at which fire to put out first?
So the question was, one, with the president referring to the press as the enemy of the people, if you felt any increased challenge or concern. And then the second part of that question was, especially with the collapse of local journalism around the United States, the targets for potential investigation appear very great, and how do you feel about that? Maybe we'll start with Wendy.
Well, I can certainly speak to the latter question about journalism and the state of journalism. We're really fortunate at the Philadelphia Inquirer to be owned by the Lenfest Institute, which is a nonprofit, and they are helping to fund a lot of the journalism that we've been able to do, and our newsroom is growing. So I feel really optimistic about what's happening in Philadelphia, and I know that that's not the case across the country. And also in Philadelphia, a lot of the small mom and pop type news outlets are closing, and I really think competition is really important. And you don't realize how important it is to have that competition for it to be a robust conversation. And so that's alarming. As far as feeling like the enemy of the people, I think that kind of cuts both ways. I feel maybe I'm in the minority that the Trump's anti-media rhetoric has somehow reinvigorated the free press, and that we're having sort of a renaissance. But that's just me. I don't know. I can't speak for... Do you want to talk about local journalism?
Yeah, so I guess to the question of the diminishing resources in journalism, I do think, speaking of a renaissance, I do think there's a renaissance in investigative reporting going on. And I think there's an influx of resources being dedicated to that in local areas. For instance, Christian did this last year. I'm doing this year as part of a program that ProPublica is doing now. It's called the Local Reporting Network, and they're choosing a number of reporters each year and basically funding us to work on year-long investigative projects that we might not otherwise have been able to do. And this year they had great success, obviously with Christian and with a number of other people, and hopefully I can't see that changing going forward. And there's a number of other places that are doing those type of things. So I think overall, if you're saying are we going to get as much great reporting out of city halls and state houses and things like that, and every sort of some of that traditional sort of important daily journalism that needs to get done, that stuff, I think we are seeing an unfortunate decline in that, and there is a, it's probably easier for officials to get away with things on the, city zoning board if no one's covering it. But at the same time, the higher level investigative projects and things like that, I think we are seeing a pretty amazing time for that. I mean, even, we're talking about like national stories. There's a team of reporters at the Wall Street Journal who are able to, drive these stories that change the narrative nationally. And that some of these stories that are being done are being followed up by the special prosecutor and stuff like that. So, I mean, I think that's sort of, I think it's a mix.
I can't, speaking to the enemies of the people thing, I've noticed on the local level, at least in my state, an outpouring of support for the work we do. And that is regardless of political party for the most part. And, we worked really hard to, Medicaid's kind of a controversial issue along partisan lines, but we worked really hard to just cut past that, and I think that's helped. But there's support in the community that I don't think is being seen at the national level. But I do work at a regional newspaper, and we had layoffs this year, and that's, of course, extremely concerning. A colleague of mine, I think he put it better than I could, that journalism is a noble profession, but this is an ignoble business. And I think we're going to have some challenges before we really figure out how investigative journalism survives, but I'm certain that it will, just because it's necessary.
David?
I'll top that. First of all of you have such inspiring stories, and for those who feel the role of journalism is to hold power to account, we applaud you, but also your editors for giving you the encouragement to kind of go along with a very demanding piece. So thank you for inspiring everyone here, and certainly that's watching. But there's no question there's a lot of issues around the future of journalism, national and local. And I'm curious, what advice would you give your 23-year-old niece or nephew who comes to you and says they want to be a journalist? They could work for Apple News, or they could work for an important local news organization. What do you tell the next generation of journalists given the world that exists today?
What would you tell your nephew or niece?
I haven't built that much advice up over the 8 years that I've been doing this compared to some of my colleagues here, but I don't regret, doing what I'm doing, and you don't get rich doing it, and there's stress that goes along with it, and I don't know exactly what the future is going to be for local papers like mine. We just got purchased by Gatehouse Media recently, which has been buying a lot of newspapers around the country, and some people are a little nervous about what that's going to mean. I don't really think about that stuff too much. I think I would just tell my nephew, if you think it's important and like doing it, then do it, and just sort of keep your head down and go in and learn how to cover City Hall and learn how to cover the zoning board, and just doing the fundamentals well. And I know that's been good for me, and I'm sorry, I don't feel like that's very profound. But
Ginger, anybody else?
If my younger relative was a niece who looked like me, I would need to tell her that the industry still has a long way to go in terms of hiring and keeping people like me. So it's a battle, and it's been a battle, and it's slowly, very slowly, incrementally, depressingly changing. But this is why I'm excited to be joining Frontline, because Rainey Aronson is actually making real change. That newsroom is starting to, it's diverse, there's women. It's not the Frontline of 15, 20 years ago. So that is significant, and it's real. And I work with students at the Graduate School of Journalism. The students of color come to me, they ask me, and it has to change. And it's invigorating to see, Matt Thompson is now in charge of where I used to work, the Center for Investigative Reporting. It's good to see people in leadership positions, things changing in a way that's not for numbers, not so that it looks good, but but you know, people committed to meaningfully changing their reporting landscapes, because it does change your reporting when you have just a range of people in there with all kinds of interesting questions and ideas and ways to do a story, and other languages. So,
do you think that your story would have been possible had you not had been from some of those communities?
No. No.
Why not?
I think the access, and I shouldn't, this is unfair also but I think some of the access we were able to get in terms of getting deep into Guatemala, or the conversations I was able to have over email with one of the convicted traffickers, and the nuance, and you know, a lot of the reporting we had to do on the ground, speaking of local reporting, we would look for local reporters to hire in the Midwest, and we couldn't find Spanish speakers. You know, the local newsrooms didn't have Spanish speakers. We had to hire reporters that we knew and send them out for 3, 4, 5 weeks, because we couldn't leave for that long with little children. But they would be out there because they had the skills or the cultural competency. And it's not necessarily somebody who's ethnic, but somebody who has the cultural competency. Our team was multilingual, multi-ethnic, you know, age, I mean, young, old. So I think it was critical to the kind of, you know, nuanced story we were able to tell. I'm on camera doing interviews in Spanish and English. I didn't need a translator. You know, I don't like the word fixer. We had collaborators, field producers in Guatemala that we worked with, and we just made sure to respect everyone a lot, you know, through that process. So,
I mean, I think investigative reporting is about abuse of power, which tends to disproportionately target vulnerable communities, or communities that historically have not had power. And so investigative reporting, to really do its job, requires kind of a deep familiarity with the challenges that low-income and minority communities face. Okay, last question, sir.
So further to this point of the challenges, but also the importance of independent media, I'm curious, 2 questions that could be to any of you. One is the process by which, with all the threads you could pull for a great story, the process by which you pick the ones you do pick. Public importance, timeliness, newness, otherwise. So we understand the filter of what we get as the story. And then 2 is, to what extent do you share with others? How do you balance the competitive, I want to keep it to just me, versus here's a thread I didn't take 3/4 of the way. Do I share it with another independent media source that could actually really run with it and make some great news?
So I'd open that up to the whole panel. One, and actually, you know what we should do? Since this last question, why don't we just start with Christian and just pass the microphone down, and each of you can pick part of that question to answer the process of picking the story. What stories do you not pick, or what lens do you put on it? And in terms of collaboration, I know, Christian, you're part of a collaborative effort. In fact, many of these stories were part of a collaborative effort in one way, shape, or form, and what that's like.
I guess in terms of the filtering of stories that we choose to do or not choose to do at a very sort of granular level, it's just, you know, you get a tip and you check it out. You know, we get phone calls and emails from people saying they've got a great story about some kind of abuse of power, and you start checking it out and looking at records to see if there's anything to verify that or corroborate it, and you find out it doesn't really check out. You know, their story, they may think this happened to them, but when you go and check, you know, independent sources, it doesn't look exactly the way it was presented to you. So that's just one, you know, baseline way of doing that filtering. Other than that, I think time is a big part of it for smaller to medium-sized papers like mine. It's, you know, we have lots and lots of good stories that I think we could be doing, but we don't have time to do them all, so it's prioritizing. You know, I feel like I can pick away at this while I'm doing my daily stuff, or, you know, we have a better sense of maybe what this story is than another, so we'll do that right now because it's more feasible. So that's sort of.
Keep it moving down. Thanks. Sorry to be brutal.
It comes down to, I think, has the story been told? And if it's been told, how has it been told? Is there a story there? So a lot of our recent work is just, it's either the story hasn't been told ever at all, or it's been told in pieces, and we figure we might have a different way of telling the story. And as far as sharing, I am a personal, I'm not a competitive, I prefer collaboration. I just feel like in the moment that we're living in, it's just as much reach as possible, because we're competing with entertainment. I mean, entertainment like we've never seen before. We're just competing for eyeballs on these very difficult to digest and ingest stories. So collaboration, I mean, our films were on Univision, and we did radio pieces. I mean, just as much reach as possible, because it's hard to get eyes on these stories.
To your point earlier about our role as a check on power, I try to look for stories where people are being hurt by the powerful or a system, and in my case, that was obvious that was happening. And my next filter, I guess, is, am I useful to this subject? You know, can I provide something new? Do I have a skill set or a background or a knowledge of a beat that can move this forward? And in this case, we saw a baby whose life was destroyed by this, gigantic system. So it was kind of a no-brainer.
So for us at ProPublica, a lot of our work is aimed at impact, right? Is aimed at how can we take something, in some cases that's being written about, and go deeper. We do have the luxury of time sometimes. Go deeper, go wider, and look for ways to change something harmful that is happening. In terms of collaboration, that is sort of also another defining feature of ProPublica. My reporting partner, Michael Grable, is here. Our editors, we took family separation and collaborated with Spanish-speaking newsrooms in Central America, with Spanish-speaking newsrooms in this country, because we were dealing with families that had been separated, and in some cases our stories led to people being reunited, families being reunited, particularly stories that we did with the help of our Spanish-speaking colleagues in their newsrooms. So.
Well, for us, the reporting on school buildings and the conditions of them is probably the least sexy story on the history of the planet. And for us, we really wanted to take it on in a way. How do we make this resonate with people? A lot of the kids in Philadelphia, they don't know what a good school is supposed to look like, or they're just not aware of what school should be. And so how do we elevate this into the public consciousness and get people, change the debate around it and get people talking about it? And also, we wanted a story, our story, to have, to energize people in a way that wouldn't drive people out of the Philadelphia school system. And that was really a challenge. But, this was the first story that I've ever done where we said, let's do a story on toxins in schools, and it came sort of from the top down. Usually it's much more organic, and one of the good, I don't have the biggest brain in the room, but like all journalists, I know a good story when I hear it. I think everybody in this room recognizes that, and that's, I'm lucky that way. It's really great. So.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what we've already mentioned about obviously trying to find stories that will have impact and stories that we have something to contribute. But I also think sometimes there are stories that we find that we're just never going to be able to get over the line. And so like I'm sure there's any of us have a number of stories on like the scrap room floor, whatever the term is, where we did as much as we could with it, and it's never going to be able to be published. We don't have enough information. So I think there's a lot of stories that people would like to be doing that are just very difficult stories, and a lot of this is, a lot of people on this panel, all the people on this panel pulled off stories that were very, very difficult to really bring about in that way. And so I think also just being aware of the realities of reporting it and how much resources it's going to take and how many resources we have, and are we going to be able to make it happen? That's also another thing that sometimes is not understood.
Yeah, I also would agree with everything that's been said. I would only add that the threshold question is always, does this matter to our audience? Do our readers care? And once we've satisfied that, then we can sort of take the next step and see if, and then of course, we've already mentioned impact, but of course we're always going for the largest impact that we can possibly have. And then the question about coordination or collaboration between I can't speak too much to that. I could say that the Wall Street Journal just produced a documentary with Frontline, which it's amazing if you haven't seen it, about a child predator on an Indian reservation. And I think that insofar as partnering with groups, you have a force multiplier and you have another medium or new mediums and new ways of telling stories, then I certainly hope that trend continues. But people on this panel, obviously there are organizations who are extremely adept at melding with other organizations and producing great journalism. And so I'm really sort of thrilled that that's a trend in the industry.
Okay, folks, that was really incredible. Hold on. I hope to see you in about 45 minutes in the forum, 6 p.m. We're going to recognize the incredible work of these folks. I wish we could give all of them the big prize, but they all get some money. Everybody, all the finalists get some money. So I hope to see you at 6 p.m. But please, I think sometimes the work of being a reporter is lost in tracking down, papers and finding sources and asking 100 teachers if any of them would do a test. This is hard work, and can you just join me in giving these reporters an incredible round of applause?